So let's jump in. Usually I have to introduce the presenter, but I'm the presenter. If this is all Corey, 24 hours, it's like early MTV, all music all the time. So I'm just going to jump into it. And beyond being the president of the Genealogical Society, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm actually a lifelong, virtually lifelong Snohomish County resident. And I was actually born in Island County. So I've got both the Sno and the Isle set. I did work in most of my adult life in information technology. I have about 30 years in analysis applications, writing queries. So even though I'm new to researching in genealogy, I am not new to writing queries. So there's some nice things that come along with as I moved from career into hobby. I did get started in earnest probably in 2020 with doing some genealogy, which means I was really doing things through the pandemic. And the coffee clutch, part of the reason I'm a big proponent of the coffee clutch is that's where I knew everybody from. It was about a year and a half before I met anyone in person. So there you go. My personal genealogical focus has, since I'm really still getting going, has really been about my US-based family. But I'm now starting to branch out into first Sweden. And so as I go through the presentation, you'll see a few things coming up. The other things to know, I'm not one of those people who want to see how far I can trace my genealogy back, just names, day they were born, day they died sort of people. I'm much more interested in the stories of the people around me. And so that was in fact part of the reason for this presentation. As was mentioned in the advertising for this, this is also for people who don't do genealogy, but are interested in family history. And so for the purpose of this presentation, I want to speak to genealogy is a subset of family history, where genealogy, you're looking to the past, you're looking at our ancestors, your blood relatives going back. And family history can take a much broader encompassing piece. And so that's kind of where I got going with this, is I wanted to get people to spin their chair around and look to the future, to talk and document about your immediate family here and now for the sake of genealogists in the future. And so keep that in mind as we go forward. That's the whole point here. And so you may have someone in mind. For me, this is Ophelia. Ophelia is my great-great-grandniece. And so when I think about the future, my ancestors, I put myself in her shoes, what she's now starting to do as a genealogist. And there's something for the purpose, there's a lot of neat things about her, but for the purpose of this presentation, the one thing you really need to know about her, she's not real. I made her up. She is a complete figment of my imagination. Great-great-grandniece. I'm only 64. I mean, it doesn't work. The picture is made up. That's artificial intelligence art. It's all made up. But the reason I did it was because it allows me to put myself in the position of someone 100 years from now, right? If Ophelia was real, she had a mother named Felicia. But like her daughter, Felicia is also not real. Now, Felicia is the imaginary daughter of Abby, and Abby does really exist, but she's 9 years old and she doesn't have a daughter, let alone a granddaughter. Keep Abby in mind. We'll come back. So this leaves us with the question that we all want to know, WWOA, what would Ophelia ask? And that's the thing we need to keep in mind when, particularly if you don't do genealogy or you're relatively new to genealogy, what are the sorts of things that someone 100 years ago want to know about you, not what you found out about someone 100 years ago. And so I'm going to make the argument that there's two broad categories. One is going to be evidence, and the other is going to be stories. Evidence are going to be facts about your family, the basic details and building blocks of genealogy. The stories are the context. They're the fun stuff that we want to always want to know about. What was so-and-so like? And there is no permit on that. We're never going to find a upbeat and positive certificate. We can't find marriage certificates. So let's jump into this and let's talk first about evidence. For those of you, again, who are new to or don't do genealogy, as genealogy, when we're out there looking for records, we're trying to find enough evidence to support our conclusions. We don't know. Ophelia, 100 years from now, is not going to be absolutely certain about what Corey Smith did. Why did he move to the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan? Why is he there? She needs enough evidence to say, I don't understand why he did it, but I'm in the 85 to 90% confident that for the 1990 census, that's Corey. And so what we should be looking for is the ability to give her names in all of our names. If you've done genealogy, you know people who have 14 different names and they're used in different ways on different documents. We then want to be able to document our relationship to everyone else in that immediate family. Dates, places are so important. That's what we build. We build, you know, it's not like a Law and Order. I have the smoking gun. This is the one piece of evidence that proves the murder. What we're doing in genealogy is an overlapping and entanglement, a web of information, of connectivity. And so those relationships between people and places, between people and things and time is what's really important. So I'm going to suggest that we have a Ophelia file. You can even spell file with a PH if that makes you feel better. I was going to do that. And there are going to be 4 things that I'm going to recommend that you put in. And by the way, the evidence part is sort of the drier part. We'll get to the story part here in a little bit. But the evidence part is really important. So I told you this wasn't going to be about genealogy, and the first thing I pull up is a genealogy form called a family group sheet. I pull that up in particular if you haven't done one. Even people, myself included, who are newer to genealogy probably aren't doing these. We're jumping onto Ancestry, onto Family Search, into our local, and we're just getting going. But particularly for you, those of you who aren't trying to document yourself in your ancestry, this is a great form you don't have to really think about what should I be putting in. These types of forms will help you. This one, the URL is at the bottom. And before Joe asks, Joe, I am going to try to get the presentation out on the website, but I'm not quite sure where. So give me till next week. This is a Gov. This is the National Archive and Records Administration. So, but they're all similar. If you go out to the interwebs, if you go out to the Googles and type in family group sheet, Family Search has forms out there, which are really good, particularly, I mean, they're good for everybody, but they have, I noticed they have some extra little doodads if you're a member of the Latter-day Saints. Ancestry has them, several sites. It doesn't matter. The main thing is you're getting names, dates, places, and I'm going to recommend that you keep it easy. At most, there's two families. There's the family that you're the adult of, your head of household, co-head of household, and there's a family in which you were a child in, right? You're not doing your genealogy. You're just trying to get those basics hammered down. By the way, Andy, if you have a question, feel free to ask it along the way. If you have a question on Zoom, again, put it in chat and Gabby will interrupt me and we'll go from there. So the second thing I'm going to recommend you add is vital records. I happen to put up some very old ones because I don't want you stealing my identity. So you don't get to see my birth certificate yet. That's also why having this, because most of these people are going to be alive, you're not going to be putting it in Ancestry or Family Search or MyHeritage. And if you do, no one's going to be able to see it because they're alive. They may not get turned. So that's why I do recommend doing this. Now, a lot of those documents, you need them for other reasons. So make a photocopy. There's nothing wrong with that. If you're comfortable with putting them together with other things, and that's just the way you're going to do it, that's great. The big three, of course, are your birth record, record of marriage or marriages, and death record. If you're not dead, you don't have to go get one. Stay alive as long as you want. It's quite all right. But throwing those in there will make her Ophelia's life a little easier, right? She's going to be able to tie those back to the individuals. This is evidence, particularly because, and again, this is for the family historians. Hopefully the people doing some genealogy already know this, but you are not a primary informant for a lot of the information. I know when my birthday is. No, I know when I was told when my birthday was. I was there, but I don't remember. My mom, she's since passed, but I'm sure she remembered it quite well and quite painfully and reminded me of it whenever I did anything bad. So there you go. If you are, but you may well know your children's birth. You probably were at your own marriage ceremony. If you don't remember it, you might want to get an annulment. Quick. I'm gonna suggest there are some times when some other additional information can be really useful. And two of them, and I'm gonna show some examples of where I've struggled a little bit in the past with some things because people didn't save them for me, but I've been able to reconstruct them. One here on the right, as you're looking at it, will be just addresses. Again, location is so powerful that you can you go in and you look at something like a birth certificate and you go, I wonder if blah, blah, blah. And there's the home address that they've lived at for 12 years. Yes, of course, that belongs to whoever. Now, the other one, this is a real document, a family document. On the left-hand side is a resume. And this is a very quick resume. This is Eric Morris Smith, my great-grandfather. He lived to be 101. I knew him. I knew him up into my mid-20s. So he was not a surprise to me, but his resume starts in June of 1905 when he graduated with his degree in mine engineering from the Colorado School of Mines, and it came up into the mid-1950s. He was definitely a job hopper. And if anybody's ever dealt with some of this, you can see that particularly in the late 20s and early 30s, people moved around. They took the job they needed to take. And that's why it can be so valuable to have this information. But it also tells me where he was, right? He either is still, and the family is still living in Okanagan, and he's just working remotely in Bremerton, or the family's moved to Bremerton. I don't know which it is, but I can figure that out. And when I see that, well, it looks like there's a census record in Okanagan, but I see something else that says he was in Bremerton, his resume will tell me he was working a job, and I can make some sense of that. Okay, so the last thing, I don't know, both of my sisters were going to try to make it. I don't know if they did make it. You know how when you go into a theater, they give trigger warnings now in case there's flashing lights, and you don't want to have a seizure. I'm going to warn my sisters in advance if they're out there. You've been warned. Family pictures are next. And I want to talk about pictures real quickly because they're a great place. If you grab, there are such things as archival pens for photographs. I would highly recommend them. But you can go in and just so everyone knows, the little girl in the picture on the right is the mother on the picture on the left. That's my mother, Barbara. You can go in there and say, you know, you don't have to do this on every photo, but some important photo you need to say, this is Glenn, he was born here, he's the son. This is Ethel, she was born here, she's the wife. Al is the husband, Barbara is the daughter. What year was it, right? I don't know where that picture was taken. It was professionally. I know, I not only know what city that one was taken in on the left, I know the address, I know what room it was in. That's the one that looked like a can of gold paint vomited on us. Anyone want to guess what decade that was from? Want to take a guess? Maybe the 1970s? Yeah, I think so.
And you might be mentioning this, but don't just write mom and dad on the back of the photo.
Yes, exactly. Now, again, if you get, my experience is that you definitely want, at least on one good quality photograph, to write the specifics. And I'm actually going to show an example here in just a moment. But full name, date of birth, that relationship to, you know, like in the picture on the left, my family, the family I grew up with. I wish my dad still had that white tie. God, I'd love that. Sorry. You can put everyone there. Also, if that's in a book, you know, get a color photograph of it or a photocopy of it and write things down the side. I know Craig, who's here in the audience, has talked about some of those ideas in terms of sharing photos where you give them to other people to fill that out. But that can be a great way. Also, don't forget, we have pretty good facial recognition right now. If you put photos in Google or other services, they will find. I've found that 6-year-olds are fairly easily identified now that they're nearly 30 because of that. And Ophelia, 100 years from now, is going to have much better facial recognition than we do. So getting one good quality picture with names will really help people. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of where I've had challenges and how having the Ophelia file from somebody would have helped. And here's the first one. About a year and a half ago, I came up with a death certificate for Walter Julius Albrechtsen, and my great-grandparents, who I never know, this said I never knew, name on it, and it made no sense. Because my grandma had an uncle, had a brother, Ed, but not a brother. There was only two of them. And I worked and worked. I just was having trouble getting my brain around this. My sisters couldn't remember anyone named Walter. And then one of my sisters went, wait, there's a picture. And so we went through tons of little photograph albums, and we came up with this. The where mother is, that's my grandmother's handwriting. That's her mother, my great grandmother, her sister Ida behind her, sister Jenny next to her. Ed, I did know Ed. He died in 1970. So I was in junior high. I knew him well, but not Walter. And he died 2 months before my grandmother was born. So I have found a lot of other things where, particularly pre-1950, it's not unusual for a child to have died, and it pretty easily gets lost, not by the immediate family, but as it goes down, you don't talk about, why wouldn't my grandmother talk about a brother she didn't know? Right? So when you fill out that list, definitely fill it out for everything and everyone. If you were here last May, I talked about my grandfather's first marriage, knew nothing about it other than he had it. Having a list of addresses that I was able to put together through other sources let me know for certain that that marriage certificate, because again, if you don't know anything, including the name of the bride, it's kind of hard to say with a high level of certainty. I mean, 50% of the data is missing. I don't know what it is. I can't validate it. But by being able to show that someone named Marguerite or Margaret lived at the same address as him, and I could show that earlier in the decade, someone with his mom's name, someone with each of his brother's names, and one of his sister's names lived at the same place. That's a lot of matching data points. And so as a family historian, this isn't important, but for Ophelia, this is going to be a big win. And so if you're filling a list with that, it's very helpful. The final one I'll show you here, and this actually, Judd, this was the one we were talking a little bit about, but also writing things on the back. So how important that is. Aunt Ida Ringwood. Now, I know the handwriting below is my mom's. I'd know that forever. I'm pretty confident that that is my grandmother. Obviously, it's a picture, it's in family, so it didn't come from somebody else. And I know that she did have an Aunt Ida, and she did marry Olaf Ringwood. And my mom was nice enough to say, pointed out in her description, Ethel's aunt on her mother's side, which is clear. It's not as clear as it could be, but it's getting closer. Here's the really interesting thing I wanted to point out, and I was talking with Judd before the meeting got started. One of the things I was having trouble doing was linking my great-grandmother and her sister, who I thought maybe showed up in a census in Minnesota in a city called St. Peter, but I didn't really have good connections because my great-grandmother's name had been changing. This all came together in less than 2 weeks, but the name and the location of the photographer of this picture is St. Peter, Minnesota. And then with the patronymic name and knowing about St. Peter, Minnesota, I was finally able to find her record where she actually landed in the shore. She came from south of Sweden through England to New York 130 years ago, later this month. So again, this one ties in a lot of neat things because I've got the name, I've got the relationship, and I've got a location, and it drives home that point of what someone like Ophelia is going to want to know from us, and we'll be very thankful, even though by the time she looks at, we'll all be gone. So let me bring up one last sticking point. I'm a perfect person. I've never made any mistakes in my life, so I have nothing to hide. Or maybe, but secrets aren't going to last long, particularly biological secrets. And I'm not telling you you have to announce to the world anything, but I am going to suggest that you think really hard about being clear, right? Walter was a secret in the sense that we didn't know about it, but it wasn't actively kept from us either. I mean, my grandmother wrote his name on a picture. We just didn't know the connection. But understandably, there are things that at one point in time, we didn't want to share. Doobie Brother fans, What Were Once Habits Are Now Vices, great album. I think there's some ways you can deal with that. If you need to, you can write it up. You can give this document to somebody that you trust to not release it. If you really don't want to talk about it with people, you can release it after you die, whatever it is. But I think we've all had our little challenges of, yeah, that's really not a problem anymore, but people just don't want to let it go. And I understand that in one way, but I'm also going to suggest to people that it will come out and it might be something worth understanding. Again, the things that become most obvious were a child perhaps that was given up for adoption. Because people like Craig go out and find things like that, don't you, Craig? Yeah, you do. Any questions? That's the end of the evidence part. How are we doing? Judd.
So if I had a picture of my great uncle, born maybe 1900, a great picture, how would I use photo recognition? I don't know his name. He's just in the picture with a bunch of other people.
Oh, yeah. So I don't have the answer. And even if I did, somewhere in the next 6 months, the answer will probably change technologically. Again, I was in tech long enough to know, don't commit to anything. But so I would start, I believe, what's dead? I'm going to have to look it up. There's one in which you can put pictures of people and places and things. And I'm not going to go try to look it up right now. Maybe Gabby's trying to do that, but it would be a place of doing that. The other thing you can do would be to try, have people done visual search in Google? Okay, yes, no. I did a little demo of that at Christmas when I was the coat of arms on a sword in searching. So if you cut that down, maybe there's something out there that looks like it. I would guess someone, keep the photograph, someone somewhere, one of these big companies is eventually going to say, hey, you know that technology where we can make your great grandmother looks like she's doing a handstand? Why don't we do something useful with it instead of freaking everybody out? Let's see if we can go searching.
I did have a success where someone said that their that their grandmother might have been my, my cousin. And she was adopted at birth. And so we have a great picture of Alice Jeffries. And I did a photo recognition within my family tree, and she came up 85% looking like my mother, which was really easy. But I need to go
Yeah.
outside the tree, if you will.
Yeah. And I will say, and again, who knows where facial recognition will be in 100 years or 100 days. But I've noticed great stuff like my grandfather and my father, until my father, they got an overlapping age in photographs of like about 75 years old. And all of a sudden, the two of them are kind of, Google's coming up. And so I'm dreading, I'll know I'm old when I gotta choose my eyewear carefully so it doesn't look like them. Yes.
Jill Ryan from Bothell, Washington. I've been a homeowner here 50 years.
Ah,
And when you're talking about genealogy and family trees, there's obviously a big problem. If in my situation, my great grandmother, I believe she was, married to two men, the same name. Both of the men have the same first and last name.
wow.
And so there's some questions about not directly to me, but like half siblings and things like that to the grandmother, because her dad had the same name as another guy that was married to him, like her mom. And it was a very strange thing, but to be aware of the strangest things happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And 100 years from now, I mean, it's tough enough teasing it out now. Add another 100 years and it's going to be really difficult to tease that out. Right. Yeah.
Just totally weird.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's a whole different thing than the family tree.
Yeah, yeah.
Based on marriages and what they presume, the genealogy showing exactly whose family is.
Right. And that also goes a little bit, again, it's not really necessarily a secret, things that are unknown and sort of undoing that. So the grandfather that I talked about in this missing marriage, who's for a variety of reasons that nobody 100% knows, and nobody was lying about it, but the three youngest children were fathered by the border. And but her husband, who she never divorced, is listed as the father on all three of their birth certificates and on all three of their death certificates. Right? Nobody ever changed that. So at some point, someone like me has to come through and clarify that. And that, you know, even when those things are not as confusing as two men with the same name, although it certainly makes, you know, donating cufflinks and monogram shirts easier, I guess. Yeah, so it's still a problem even when they have different names, is trying to figure that out.
Anticipating the current policy. Explaining in some sort of written form that these are two different distinct people would be helpful.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly right. And that idea of helping your Ophelia with what's confusing, because particularly for those of us who are doing genealogy now, it's a little easier for us to turn around and go, okay, what are the examples? And that's why I'm showing you examples from my life instead of trying to come up with scenarios that just seem interesting. Here are some things. And so in my life, what's my equivalent of having a woman who has two husbands, both with the same name.
So the microphone is helping, but if you could go ahead and summarize, they're not hearing everything.
Okay, absolutely. Okay. So let's jump out into stories, and I'm using stories real broadly here. And it can be anything. And I'm gonna give you 5 examples, a character sketch, a correspondence, artifacts, accomplishments, and travels. And I'll talk about some other things and some ways of doing that after I get through these. But I felt like they were the best way for me to use a story to describe stories, whatever that means. But literally, and again, my sisters and I have been going through some things of our moms. Even though she passed away in 2009, stuff keeps popping up. And fortunately, I think we've killed all the Christmas ornaments. I think we're done with that. But this picture is literally a pocket watch from my great grandfather. And that is a list that my mother made for her father-in-law, so my paternal grandfather, stuff that was in his safe deposit box. And you can tell it's old because it talks about the Aurora Village Sea First Bank. So there you go. Who? So let's dive into these, and like I say, we'll get into some of these others, but I think these are really interesting. So let's start with a character sketch. And so the idea of a character sketch would be someone that you knew. I'll talk about this later. Someone that you knew and that you wanted to kind of share some stories and the essence of who you felt that person was. Christian Tanner is my father's mother's father. He died 3 months before my dad was born. My dad never knew him. And this was a character sketch done in the early 90s by his youngest daughter, my grandaunt Bubs Stokes. And it's such a nice piece when I read it to have some sense of it. And so, you know, when we think about this, not only do I not know, but none of his grandchildren knew. So no one in my father's generation knew him. There was only one who was even alive, my dad's brother, and he was only like a year and a half. So a character sketch, and I've seen classes on writing character sketches and how to do that. And actually, we may be trying to do something with a group. Probably won't be till next season, so in the fall time. But I find this so interesting. She talks about his, as she understood it, his life growing up in Norway, which is interesting because some of the pieces line up with Christian's older brother did a piece, an interview with one of his nieces, and it's documented. And I can match up pieces about his travels down from Norway to Switzerland, where his father was originally from, to get his degree in engineering. To say I wasn't the first person to go to college was something of an understatement. But fascinating stories about probably a great grandfather who is not the nicest human being. But you know, early 1800s on the top of Norway. It's cold. You're a veterinarian, who knows? So I think character sketches are really interesting. A couple of things that I've noticed in talking to other people who've done them and also reading some. I'm not sure. Well, don't do one for yourself. Call it something else. Call it a memoir. you could think of a memoir as a character sketch about yourself. Also, I think there's something to be said for being able to have a little distance, either being too negative about the person or too positive. You might not get the flavor and the characteristic of them. But here's an example of a daughter. But obviously there was a lot of time. I mean, he died in 34. This was written in 92. So there was some water went under the bridge. If there were any too much positive or too much negative, that would have softened over time. But I would definitely put in that individual memoir in the same sort of category. Has anyone done character sketches? Have you? Do you find it an interesting process? Oh,
To, write about some of my family, so I've written quite a bit about some of them, but I was gonna do a pictorial of them, like some collages of them along with it, so we have pictures of all those aspects. And like I'm hoping to develop a book on each person, a little, like a small little.
yeah.
It has their pictures and even kind of a scrapbooking thing, but
Yeah.
a little different than maybe scrapbooking is.
Yeah, that's it. And I think the format is really, so if the people on the Zoom didn't pick up all of that, she's talking about also bringing in pictures on that. And I think you do overlap with a scrapbooking. And I think that, I didn't want to get out here and pretend to be the scrapbooking expert. If you need anything on that, I'm guessing that if you search really hard, there might be something on the internet about scrapbooking, like 4.8 million hits.
It's a little different than scrap.
I think you could build it in. So you could do, the character sketch is its own piece, but the vehicle that you pass down, so the adding of the collage of pictures and things of that nature, you could also potentially think about character sketches in pieces. And this would also be true of remembrances. It would be really interesting if again, I'm thinking more about myself, but it could also be in a character sketch, how you looked at something at one point in time and then how you looked at it in another point in time could be really, really interesting as that distance from the initial event or the initial person.
And so I interviewed one of my grandmothers, my father's mother, in 1980, just asked her questions and had a tape recording of her before people were doing a lot of that, and put together a story of her pioneer experience coming across in a wagon train and those and what, really what it was like to have a preemie baby born at home on her couch, and the fear she went through, and the lack of medical, technology, and all the guesswork that went into trying to take care of a newborn baby that was only about 3 or 4 pounds. She kept him in her oven. She had hot sandbags around him and kept in her oven. And every morning she said she'd wake up worrying he had passed away during the night. She'd open up the oven and there he'd be with his eyes wide open, kicking and smiling at her. And she said he was a good eater and he survived.
And that is a story. That's fantastic.
That's the story of Violet Farron and her son Roger Farron.
Yeah.
The man that was my.
Yeah, that's fantastic because, and again, I think you're right on target. We have opened to us other ways of capturing audio and video. I will only say, again, as a technologist, every technologist who sells technology will assure you that it will last forever. Right? Just put it on those 5 1/4 floppy inch drives. They'll be around forever. So finding a great way of doing that and keeping it, but what a great story. Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump over and I'm gonna talk a little bit about correspondence here. This is a little hard to read, but this was such a fascinating letter. We talked about the picture of Ida Ringwood. So this would be this was a letter written by my maternal grandmother's first cousin to my mother. And my mom at the time was starting to do some genealogy and wanted to know about her father, her grandfather and grandmother who were in Spokane. And Elsie is the name of the woman who wrote the letter, had almost nothing about her uncle, my mom's grandfather, which I'm finding out to be, we didn't get any more records on him yet. I don't know where he came from. I'm guessing he may have come down from Canada. So we're going to go looking. But it was really interesting, this, and I would put this in the category, I put it in correspondence, but I would put it in the broader category of conversation, right? This was, you talked about the conversation, you know, interviewing someone. In a sense, this was, Jerry, get ready for this. This was asynchronous conversation. Sorry, that's an inside joke just for me and Jerry. But she goes through and she talks about my great-grandmother being artistic, being so kind to her and making things for her, which lines up with some stuff that I found in articles in the Spokane Spokesman Review and Spokane Chronicles about her winning some awards for either artwork or fabric or things of that nature. But more importantly, she talks in here about how she would address the envelopes from her mother back to what would be my great-great-grandparents. And so there's some addresses there for me to look at and work on. I'm trying to do the handwriting, which is now 60 years on from her memory. She's doing this. But also because she's trying to put the Swedish on it, so it makes some sense. But what was so really interesting was she in here goes, and they had a brother named August who never moved to the US. And again, Judd, I was talking about how I know it's time to merge. I've got this Swedish household examination record. How do I connect Sophie Albrechtsen to this Karin Sophia Johan's daughter? Well, she's referred to her parents by these names. Okay, that's good. And the place she said she was from, that's good. And she has two sisters, and that's good, matching. And in her obituary, it says, and she had a brother who never left Sweden. And this letter ties it all back and says, his name was August. And I can now go look at my DNA matches on my heritage. I'm probably going to find descendants of August at this point. And so these little bits are really interesting. I will also say the other funny thing about this, right after it gets done with this, I mentioned my wife and I, how my wife and I spent a few years in the suburbs of Detroit. So if you were looking at the 1990 census, which you won't be able to do for a while, probably none of us are going to be able to look at it. Right in this letter, she goes, I'm so excited that you're going to be able to see Corey and Eva, and they've been gone for so long. So if you're her, this letter doesn't tell you I'm in Detroit area, but it does tell you in the early 1990s, I've been away from Seattle for a couple of years. And so you're going to be able to put those overlapping things together and go, this makes a more defensible claim. So how am I doing time-wise? Ooh, not too bad. Okay. Let's have some fun. I was over helping Phyllis with her computer, and I looked in her mantle, and there's this clock. Doesn't look exactly like this clock, but artifacts are really cool. And I have a ton of things. I brought my sword in here from the German, a German soldier. It was a ceremonial sword that my grand uncle borrowed as the war was finishing up. This is so cool. We got this from my wife's uncle. He's starting to get rid of some things. Okay, how many people know somebody or has a family where you do things like name your children Arthur MacArthur or Peter Peterson? Or really? You didn't have more creativity. Anyway. Oh, Arthur. Actually, it's not Arthur. The clock belongs to Robert and Minnie MacArthur. I'll have to change that. Arthur was my wife's grandfather. I knew him as well. Very nice man. But we got this clock home and I'm trying to figure out, I wonder, we don't know anything about this clock. And it's like, okay, how are we going to figure out? And I'm getting mentally prepared and I pop off the back of the clock. And her grandfather took a 3x5 card, said, this is from the Woodcraft Lodge in Tenino, Washington, for my parents' marriage. And here's the date that I know that they got married on. Here's their names. And he signed his full name, including middle initial. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for making it that easy. This was a gift. A similar story, I was 2 years ago, my dad moved out of his condo that he and my mom had lived in for a couple of decades after we left the gold explosion house. And there's been this fold down desk and I thought it was really cool. It was really nice, but nothing special. And I opened up one of the drawers and there was a card in my mom's handwriting. It said, this was the desk. This desk was made by Charles Woolridge for his daughter, Bessie Woolridge, who is my great grandmother. And it'd been sitting in there. I don't know how it ended up at their place. It was never in our home, the one that you guys saw the picture of us all in. So I don't know how it ended up, whether it was something my grandfather had, whatever, but just amazing. And so there's a couple of things I would highly recommend. First off, to do an inventory of the artifacts. And you can write it down or you can take your phone and walk around. But I can guarantee you, having been the child to help after at least one parent passed away and when the other one was moving out, you will think you know what is a family heirloom and what came from Target, but I guarantee you're going to get it wrong and it's really going to ruin your life when you finally figure out you kept the $29.95 clock from Target and you gave away the heirloom clock. The way I've heard it described is you can walk around with your camera and it says, act like a ghost. Walk around like it was the day after you died and walk around and record everything. And I think it's a great idea. Artifacts are so interesting. There's so much more there if we know about them. And I know we had people in December bring in some things. Who brought in the little truck? The cast iron there. We had way too much fun Googling that. But definitely, and as that family historian, figure out what are the really important pieces and document them.
Can I make a suggestion that not necessarily physical things? Like I have a recipe that my mom gave me and it's literally titled Secret Recipe. It's my great grandmother's. It's not written on there anywhere. I should probably write that down.
We're going to come back to recipes. I'm not going to specifically call them out, but because I decided not to, I was going to run long. I knew that. And I'm already going to run longer, but we'll talk about them in just a moment. Let's do that. Also, I think, we talked about resumes, but accomplishments and other newsworthy things I think are really interesting. The thing on the right, the thing on the left, my paternal grandmother was a teacher. And right out of college, she went down and worked at the Washington School for the Blind in Vancouver. Absolutely. And if you look back a few decades, so boy, our terminology has gotten a lot better, but blind was okay. She was down there for about 2 years before she got married and moved back to Seattle after my grandfather was done with college. And she wrote this incredible article, it's just 2 or 3 pages, about starting I believe it's YWCA Bluebells. It's kind of like the junior level of campfire girls, bluebirds. For girls who can't see. And some of the stuff, the interaction with other people in the Portland area chapters, there's a really interesting section on trying to teach manners, etiquette, not manners, etiquette. Things like laying down your silverware in the, again, this was a long time ago. We don't spend a lot of time making sure young ladies know which fork you eat with. We try to get them into STEM, but which is good. But she said, her insight there is most people learn, at least get introduced to these things, not through being taught, but by watching. And none of these girls have ever been able to watch people set the table or do any of this stuff. Really interesting. Later in 1946, she set up a program that allowed students in the Seattle School District to get work credits. And she actually worked on, there's another article from 1965 where she was still working pretty much on the same thing, which is really interesting. There's some other things that I've shared with people over the years, but I find this need to find out whether your grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather served with George Washington or not is sort of, that's fine. But I think there's these little pieces of where our family was part of a bigger tapestry of history, and that we should tap into that, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. So the final one I want to leave you with is travels. I cannot express the pure surprise that my maternal grandmother in her scrapbook has a picture of her in front of an airplane in 1928 with the phrase "off to Seattle." You think you're worried about getting on a Boeing plane today? Look at that damn thing. And this is not, the other grandmother is the grandmother I could see doing that. If you had told me, but going through her pictures, I'm like, oh my goodness, you spent 3/4 of your life at the beach. Put on a towel. All of a sudden I'm the old person and 20-year-old her is having a great time. But travels in my own personal life have such a can have a really transformative aspect to how you view the life, and it cascades. Real short story. I have tons of brother-in-laws. One of them moved to Sweden for just a couple of years, and that was in 1988, 1989. He still hasn't moved back. He's got 4 kids, a grandkid, a big house, a condo in Spain. Well, actually, we will be seeing him soon, but he won't be moving back anytime soon. But his kids are US Swedish dual citizens, and 3 of the 4 actually came and lived with my wife and graduated from Jackson High School up in Mill Creek. And one day, one of the girls was talking about the fact that, even my wife and I, our first trip over and, her dad showing us around, and we looked at her and went, your dad went to Europe because we went on a big trip in 86. She's like, no, he was first. I went, no, we were 3 years before him. And it occurred to her that maybe if my wife and I had not decided to go to Europe for 5 weeks, that she wouldn't exist as a carbon-based life form. The travel was transformative to us individually and as a couple, but it's a butterfly flapping its wings, and it had a transformative nature on how that is. And so there are now people in Sollentuna, Sweden, who graduated from Jackson High School. So where are we? Oh, perfect. I didn't even time this out, and it's right. I love that. Let me mention a few things. So before I forget, recipes. I think music, art, recipes are fantastic. If you pulled out, when my dad grew up and said, and then went out to the Googles and said, what were the most popular songs of 1952? He was on the half cycle, I think 52 when he graduated, 53. No, gotta have to look that up. You would have got back a list of music there is no way he would have listened to. He loved jazz, still loves jazz. When I went over and saw him this morning, he was listening to KXNX, whatever it is. And classical. But we're going to go out there and we're going to assume we know something, and it's like, no. So recipes. I think a family recipe book would be really cool, but I've been doing some research on something called nuts and bolts. Nuts and bolts, everyone looks at it and goes, Chex Mix. And I'm going, it's called nuts and bolts. Chex Mix is something different. Okay, what's in nuts bolts? Well, peanuts and pretzels and a lot of Chex, but it's not Chex Mix. Anyway, I thought it was airplane grandma. And I figured, oh, this is some secret from Sweden. I know, why would there be Chex Mix in Sweden in the 1880s? Just play along with me on this one. But I went out to the Googles, and you'll never guess who invented Chex Mix. Unless you guess the Chex Company, because you're exactly right. And you can go out and you can see the recipe on the side of the Chex box from the 1950s and 60s. But why 100 years from now, Ophelia is going to be making Chex Mix called Nuts and Bolts, and she's going to have no idea why. Write it down. I think a little recipe book would be phenomenal. A great idea.
Well, not only that, great case, she baked cakes. So that's why that recipe is important. She baked my mom's wedding cake. So, it's an integral part of her story.
Right. And
just a recipe.
And so character sketch meets recipe book. Exactly. Right. Just like we were talking about, character sketch meets scrapbook. And we have lots of ways. And that's, I wanted to open up possibilities in this, not be prescriptive. A couple of things that I think are worth thinking about. Again, I talked about using your camera or your tablet to walk around and record things, but also recording conversations. I would recommend that if you're going to, the things that I've seen, it seems like if there's a real personal item that the two people involved should have that conversation. But for instance, I mentioned earlier, what would be my great granduncle Jacob. The interview that I read of his was done actually by one of his nieces, not one of his children. And I think it was really interesting to have, again, a little distance. You know enough to go, if you make me, I'll go home and ask your sister about my mom about this, but I think she's got it, you can challenge it, but you don't have, you don't, you're not like a dog with a bone. So you're neither dispassionate nor, no, I'm going to challenge you on everything. There are some great apps out there. There's some do-it-yourself stuff. I believe if you're familiar with NPR, the StoryCorps, they have an app out there that you can use for your own stuff, or you can do that. And so again, I would highly recommend, and what we all say with genealogy is, if you're getting new to genealogy, what's the first thing you do? You go find the oldest person you know and you go talk to them, because you don't know what you don't know. And if they leave, you know what I mean by leave. You're never going to be able to ask again. So definitely scrapbooking, I think, is really interesting.
Point on sometimes get two of the old people together with each other to reminisce about old times. And they start talking about things that you never even imagined asking. We had that happen with my grandmother and her sister. They started talking about things that we never knew. Just by having, sitting with each other and having a conversation and us taking notes.
And that's a great point, is that conversation reinforces each other. I mentioned to Judd before his presentation last month that his bio said he was from Dayton, Washington. This had come up, Dayton, Washington had come up like 3 times in 3 weeks. And my dad, out of nowhere, after decades of telling us the story of working summers in the pea canneries, all of a sudden he said Dayton, and I went, where's Dayton? I know right around Anacortes. It's over by Walla Walla. I went, 40 years you've been telling us this story. You just now thought to mention that you had to hitchhike home from Dayton, Washington in the 1950s. And I want to have a conversation with Grandma as to why she allowed you to hitchhike in the 1950s from Dayton, Washington back to Seattle. We talked about labeling pictures. I want to go back to 2 things. One, using the archival pen, giving the ink a chance to dry. Don't start stacking them up, write on them, and you don't have to write detailed on every one of them, but pick a good representative one and do that. There are 12,000 pictures and slides of the North Cascade hikes that my grandfather has. I can't tell the forest from the trees, literally. They're all going to get thrown away eventually. Also, the Craig's idea of photocopying them and writing, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, you've sent it out to people and asked them to fill in, and your treat was, if you do that, I'll make you a real copy of the photo so you have it, or a digital.
So one of the ways that I convinced my mom's second cousin to do a DNA test was just before Thanksgiving, and this was the key thing, is before Thanksgiving, before family was getting together, I mailed him photocopies on 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper with 4 pictures to a sheet with lines underneath to ask them to caption them. Included a self-addressed stamped envelope to have it returned to me, and a checkbox where they could check, I want a copy of this picture. They got together for Thanksgiving dinner, and everybody started looking at them and reminiscing and filling in captions. People were apparently going crazy over pictures that they had never seen before. And so I ended up making about 3 dozen pictures to send to this cousin that they distribute out to the other family members. I mean, one of them was a cousin of theirs that there was a picture of him as a small boy with a dog that was his beloved pet dog. They were so poor, they did not have a camera and never had a picture of that dog. And that is now one of his cherished possessions.
That is so great. Yeah, so definitely that can be the trigger to help people genealogically, to help people now with the past, but again, we can make life easier for Ophelia so she doesn't have to beg, borrow, and steal to get people to participate. I'll wrap up here, or we're just about done. Pick someone to inherit the documents. The next one, upload memories to a public tree. I'll put a caveat on that. Be careful. If you are still talking about people who are alive, you probably shouldn't be doing that. But Family Search and Ancestry both have the equivalent of memories. So you can put them there, or you can give them to someone. Take that Ophelia file, put it with the other legal documents for when you pass, so that someone has them and knows, particularly if maybe you don't want to tell a story until after you have passed on. So it's there. So let me bring this full circle with a story about stories. This little cup, actually, this one's my sister's, but my great-grandma Bessie, who I talked about earlier a little bit, made these cups for my sisters and I in the 60s. And my wife and I don't have children, so I was thinking about what I was going to do with mine and how I wanted to deal with that. And so I got some stuff about her that I had captured, a picture, and I took the cup and I put it in something. And that the last night we were at my parents' condo, we had a dinner, and Abby, whose imaginary daughter gives birth to an imaginary daughter named Ophelia, I gave it to Abby. And she was 7 at the time. It was 2 years ago. And she now has a cup, just like her grandma's, just like her grand aunt. And I'm not sure I'd recommend they drink out of it. It was made in the 1960s, probably made of lead and plutonium. We're a tougher breed back then. But nevertheless, at some point, Abby has that, and she knows about a great grandmother, but her grandma remembers her. Her great grandfather is still alive and remembers her great grandmother and can tell those stories. And when it's time, she can give it to whatever the name of her child is. It probably won't be Felicia, and Felicia can give it to Ophelia or whoever, and just make so that 100 years from now, what would Ophelia ask? Hopefully she asks, how come you guys were so smart to leave me all this great documentation? So I'll take some questions. I'll give some answers.
And you guys raise your hand and just pass it amongst yourselves.
And the Zoomsters, if you want to put questions in chat, we'll take them that way too. Anything? Anyone? Go ahead. Yeah.
Offend anyone with a kind of a religious point. We're Christians in my family, but my ex-husband got involved in sort of a cult at one point, and they were telling him, he was born in 1950, and they were telling him suddenly that he, like backtracking, and like he was reincarnated, and he was led to believe he was born in 1920 in Europe. And you know, you have to be careful, I think, what somebody might say to you, like in a situation, if you know they're involved in something like that, because he was telling my daughter he was really 30 years older than he was, and that he wasn't really like who he thought he was. And he got straightened out after a while, but
Yeah.
some of these time track cults can really disturb someone's real family tree.
And there are a variety of reasons. Let me pivot off on that, because I mean, people will, for any number of reasons, start documenting things that aren't the case, and 100 years later, they really throw things off. When I did the presentation about my grandfather's first marriage, we talked about the fact that they lied about some things, but you're a communist union supporting Jew post World War I, whose father got convicted of sedition and deported. There are some reasons you might not tell the government everything you need to know. People who lied about their age to get married, and people who lied about their age to either get into or out of a war. And so I think you're right. Whatever the reason is, you do need to be careful. And I would say that the Ophelias of the world 100 years from now have to be just like the genealogists of today, which is to step back and say, this is great information, I need to validate it. Can I find the birth certificate? Can, whatever. And that also may be a character sketch or a personal thing, a remembrance of a time that he might put down, that might be informative and interesting, but, certainly that's his decision. Ah, yeah, yeah, yeah. 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 Oh,
We're not all descended from Indian princesses.
oh, yes. True. True indeed. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, this isn't really a question, but I'm sitting here thinking about character sketches and stuff. And so I'm gonna give my siblings homework, and we're all gonna do character sketch on my parents. One has been dead 35 years, the other one 20 years. And so it would be kind of fun to get us all together with each other's ideas of what we remember, our fondest memories and just different things, and then sit around with a couple bottles of wine and read them or something. So thanks for the idea.
You bring up a couple of great points in there, that getting the family together, it goes to the conversation. What Craig was talking about, something that gets the conversation started, and however you want to record it, whether it's on an app or writing things up, whatever it is, I think that is just a great way to get it flowing. And people want to talk about that stuff maybe more than genealogy. I know a lot of us here love genealogy. We want to know about 150 years ago. But when my sisters and I get together, or we get together with any of our sets of cousins, the stories flow. And we talked about the Tanner family. That was my grandmother and her siblings, that family was close, and we had huge gatherings for Thanksgiving and Christmas Eve. And my wife and I still do very large gatherings, or had been, for Thanksgiving. And that was part of that. And again, you may find, 100 years later, you're like, why do we all get together? Or like on my wife's side, how come there are Pop-Tarts in our Christmas stockings? Someone knows the answer.
One of the new features that Ancestry.com has, and it's one that anybody can use, you don't have to be subscribed, is their StoryMaker tools for actually creating online stories where you can include multimedia, pictures, text, for recording those kinds of stories on Ancestry, so it will be there for Ophelia to find 100
Right.
years from now.
Right. Yeah. Gabby, anything from our Zoom people?
No,
Any
not
questions?
people, but I have a comment.
Okay,
One of the things you can also do, because, talking about getting your family together and getting those perspectives, my mom has done this and I've done this for my parents. And we did it old school. It involved paper and letters and mail and all those things, but you could probably do it through email. Is actually go out to their friends and family and have them write what they remember about them. And we did it for my mom and dad's anniversary. We did it for my grandmother's 85th birthday. Put it all in 80th birthday. Sorry, Mom. Put it all into a book and surprised it with all these remembrances of their friends and family from across the world.
yeah, very cool. And does anyone, anyone else have anything that they're doing or that they've really benefited from that they want to share? Okay. All righty, well, I think we've reached our point. I will, we've got a few minutes here on in-person. We'll, if you guys want to chat in the final 30 minutes here, that'd be great. And if you have any questions about, maybe running for office, happy to take those. Gabby, are we ready to let the Zoomateers, depart? All righty. Hey, Zoom people, thank you so much for being here. I'm glad we could help out. And thank you everyone here.